How to record Game Boy Color games using the infrared while communicating with other Game Boy Color games. Let's take a step back. How do you get a clean recording of a Game Boy game? Using only first-party peripherals, you can get a recordable video out from a Game Boy game by putting it in a Super Nintendo with Super Game Boy. But how do you do that while using a link cable? Use the Japan-exclusive Super Game Boy 2, which has a link cable port, so that we can link it with another Game Boy and thus have recordable video out while using the link cable. The Game Boy Player peripheral for GameCube can be used to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games, and all of them with link cable support. Sounds like a great deal. But what if we want to record something that is using the infrared port on the Game Boy Color? We're kind of out of luck. Neither of those two have an infrared port. Even if we turn to emulation, there are only very few emulators that support infrared at all, and they only support putting one signal into the game, mimicking using an actual remote control sending a signal to the Game Boy Color. This is used on these purple pads here to access bonus stages in Bomberman Max, so that's something you can record from emulation. But sending levels and Carabomb battles are handled by having two Game Boy Colors communicating with each other using infrared. That is not fully supported by any emulator, so the only option left is use a third-party console. There are a lot out there, but I only know of two that play Game Boy Color games and have an infrared port: the Analogue Pocket and the recently released Modretro Chromatic. As of writing, the only clean footage of a Carabomb battle is from me using the Pocket, but it was a struggle. So the Pocket needs to be put in the dock for there to be a video out, but because the infrared is on the bottom of the Pocket, it is covered and thus unusable while docked unless you get a USB-C extension cable. Even with that done though, the experience is not good. Like, yeah, I got it to work, both Pocket to Pocket and Pocket to Game Boy Color, but it does not like working. It is the most finicky thing I have ever seen, and it took me like 30 minutes of trying around before I finally got it working. I'm glad they bothered giving it an infrared port, but did they bother to test this thing? Bottom line is, if you're trying to do anything with the infrared, I recommend against the Pocket, especially not when the Chromatic exists. This is not a full review, but just a comparison on the infrared specifically. The Modretro Chromatic has a video out of the box. Just hook up the USB-C port to your computer and it will recognize it as a video signal. Might end up upside down, but that's not a big problem. And here we have two Chromatics, and the infrared just works. I can just position them at each other and it works. No more messing around with two Pockets for 30 minutes. Chromatic linking with Game Boy Color, meanwhile, I do get the error where I send from the Chromatic, the Color says processing, but Chromatic seems to get no signal back. With enough trying around, it will work though, and that's kind of the bottom line for me. There are plenty of other comparison or review videos on these things. Chromatic is cheaper, doesn't need a dock to record, but doesn't play Game Boy Advance games. Pocket plays Game Boy Advance games, you can get some extra peripherals for it to play a whole lot of other games, but boy did they mess up the infrared. In conclusion, not speaking for these consoles as a whole, but if you are trying to play anything that uses the infrared module, you will have a lot more success with the Modretro Chromatic than with the Analogue Pocket. It will run best with two Chromatics. Thank you for watching. Unfortunately, Turbo Link remains unsupported by both the Analogue Duo and the Pocket with the TD16 peripheral, and it's not supported by any emulators, so we're still out of luck on that department.